think Josie's having issues with her headset. Let's try this. Hi all. So I'm Rob from Arup. I'm a transport planner based in the London office, and today we'll be giving you a sort of quick overview about Arup itself, about transport consulting, which is where we work, and also give you a quick idea about what it's like to work in Arup. So as I said, I'm Rob. I'm a senior transport planner, and I started at Arup in 2015 as a graduate. And most of my work to date has been on fairly large infrastructure projects such as airports and train stations. My colleague Josie is here. Josie, are you able to give an intro?
Hi, hello. Finally, my earphones have begun to work just in time. My name is Josie. I work with Rob with the transport consulting team in Arup's London office. I joined in January this year, so around 8 months now. So I'll be the entry level role I suppose lots of you are hoping to apply to. So I'll be speaking about life of a grad towards the end of this presentation today.
Cool. We'll get started then. If you can go to the next slide, please.
Oops, what just happened?
That was pretty bizarre. I think we're good now. Okay, so Arup, if you may or may not have heard of us, so we're a relatively large engineering company, traditionally engineering anyway, but now we're all sorts of designers, planners, management consultants, you name it. We all work together under one umbrella. Most of our projects are typically buildings projects, so designing buildings, but we're also working on infrastructure such as roads, and more recently, I guess in the last decade or so, we've also moved into more of a consulting role, an advisory role, so management consulting, asset management, that kind of thing. The company was founded in the 1940s by Sir Ove Arup, who was a Danish engineer. And he essentially was a private company, and he decided that he would make it a trust. So the company is now held in trust by us. So the people who work at Arup were known as its members, and there's no shareholders. So what that allows us to do, if you move to the next slide, is to have a relatively unique approach to our work, which is founded on our kind of philosophy of total design, which is that interdisciplinary way of working between architects, engineers, and planners. It also allows us to do fairly cool things because we're not beholden to any shareholders. So our company strategy is now firmly based on sustainable development, and that's kind of ingrained in everything we do. So from the work that we bid on to how we design our projects, and to who we work with in terms of sub-consultants and architects, is all founded on sustainable development. We also use a portion of our profits on community engagement, so outreach with charities such as Engineers Without Borders. There's other ones called like Bridges to Prosperity, where we'll design bridges for places in usually Africa and Asia, to improve access in communities, and then innovation as well.
Why does it keep on moving?
I don't know, it's weird.
Okay, there we go.
So
Sorry.
Innovation, what we mean by that is we'll also invest some of the profits in, I guess, areas of research that our members are interested in. So we've got this sort of platform called Invest in Arup, and we'll invest a portion of money in research to I guess add value to our work, or to invest in more community engagement through that, which is pretty cool. Next slide, please. So this is where we are around the world. We're pretty much on, are we? Yeah, we're on every continent. So that's 84 offices. 86 services, and the services range from anything from transport planning, which is what we're discussing, to civil engineering, to mechanical engineering, to management consulting, etc., etc., etc. Next slide, please. And this is just where we are in the UK. So we're based in London, but we've got a fairly significant presence all around the UK, including Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland as well. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of what we do in transport consulting. In London, we're broadly split into three sort of skills areas. Cities is where I sit, and we work on master plans, residential developments, and commercial developments. They're the three main focus areas, but there's also a lot of other kind of bespoke projects and strategies and stuff. Strategic transport then is more on a high level, sort of broader basis. So where cities is more site focused, or a strategic transport project is likely to be more citywide or regional focused. And that's where a lot of our transport modeling work is done. And a lot of those projects would be considered major projects as well. There's also rail, which does quite a lot of different types of work. Rail operations is quite engineering focused, so looking at junctions and track alignments and essentially trying to form timetables for the railway. Franchising then is where we'd partner with a private company to bid for a franchise from the Department for Transport. And then there's various other feasibility studies that we get involved in as well, which are generally led by the Department for Transport. So that could be asset management or providing support to engineers. This is just a very brief flavor of some of our projects. You may or may not have seen them. So some examples would be Euston Station is down the bottom there. That's the project I've been working on for the last few years. So that's quite a significant, large project. There's a few smaller sort of residential master plans scattered around there as well. You can see Gatwick Airport, and then a pretty cool one is up the top, the Fitzpark scheme, or Fitzpark Parklet on Windmill Street, which was a sort of collaboration between us, our landscape architect in Arup, and the local sort of enterprise partnership in Fitzrovia in London. So we kind of piloted this parklet idea pre-pandemic in a street in Fitzrovia, and it turned out to be quite popular. Next slide, please. So everything we do kind of has a lens on the end user. So that's you, that's me, and what we need from a particular project. In practice, that means working with other designers to design places that support a good way of living, working, and leisure, and also providing adequate connections between places where people work, live, and I guess do their leisure. Next slide, please.
Yes.
The outcomes of
I'm
these
concerned about the
are,
it's got too many stories.
Josie, would you mind muting your mic, please?
Yeah, I was
if that's
reading
possible.
just now.
Sorry?
Would you mind muting your mic?
Oh, yes. That's a very good
I
suggestion.
think there was a message about that. Middle of the screen, down the bottom, I think. Cool, thank you. So the outcomes are driven by each project. So in some cases, they'll be led by ourselves or sort of promoted by ourselves, other times by the client, other times by the local authority. So oftentimes we're looking at improving the local economy all the time. We're looking at enhancing the environment, both in terms of placemaking, in terms of reducing carbon, in terms of just generally promoting sustainability. And then there's always a focus on improving the community for the people who live and work in the places that we're designing. Next slide, please. So this is probably the most dry slide, I think. It's just an introduction to our activities in our cities projects. So quite often we'll work with the client to ultimately gain planning permission. So we essentially need to satisfy the local authorities, so local planning authority or highway authority, such as Camden or the Greater London Authority. Oftentimes the priority of those bodies will be to promote non-car modes, which we would obviously support, and also local issues such as bus provision and congestion. So the idea behind our work then is to kind of to balance the requirements of the project, so be that a new building or a new master plan the with the priorities of the local authority, which is based on their local plan. So our work then is generally supporting the design team. So that's whoever we're working with within Arup, generally civil engineers, landscape architects, structural engineers, that kind of thing. On access to buildings, on servicing, so waste and deliveries and stuff like that. Parking, emergency access, all these transport related things that go into designing a building or a master plan. And then the output of that is a transport assessment. So we'll describe what we're doing in terms of transport, but also assess the impact of the project on the local area. So if it's a small project, we'll write a small transport statement, just saying, there's this many additional car journeys expected, or this many additional people expected to take the tube or the bus to our development. And then for a larger project, it'll be a much larger transport assessment that will involve a lot more discussions with the local authority and a lot more assessment to make sure that our development doesn't have too much of an adverse impact on the local area in terms of transport. Next slide, please. So these are just a couple of examples of projects that we do in the cities area. So Meridian Water, which I think I saw you might have had a presentation on yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, cool, got it right. So this is an ongoing project that we've been working on for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. It's led by our site development team in Arup, and we provide the transport input. So initially, we were kind of helping out with the overall master plan vision. So setting out where the roads might be, where they'd connect to the existing road network, where bus routes might go, how we connect to the cycle network, that kind of thing. And then as the project developed and we get into designing individual plots and individual buildings, we'll be looking in more detail at plot access and the location of cycle parking and the connections to the road network and stuff like that. And then, yeah, you can just see a list of our kind of activities there. Barking Riverside is a similar project, but much more residential focused. So Barking is located in East London on a large sort of brownfield site near the river. And our work, again, was very similar to the Meridian Water work, although all master plans are different because every site is different and every client is different and every local authority is different. So even though you might employ similar principles to every project and the documents that you produce will be similar, how you get to that is very, very different for every single project. So there's quite a few of these projects that we work on all around London and all around the UK. Next slide, please. So strategic transport. So I guess the best way of describing this is that if you have a major project, there's various different stages of the project. So there's planning early on, then there's more detailed design and implementation in the middle, and then after, well, then you have construction, operation, and management. So our work in this area comes right at the start. So typically we'll be employed by a public sector body to complete a feasibility study into a particular project. So that could be a new railway link or a new road or yeah, in terms of transport, I guess those are the main ones. So we'll develop options and then work with other disciplines within Arup to figure out which options are most viable or least viable, and develop business cases, and just generally contribute to that feasibility study to inform whether the project should go ahead, and then if it should go ahead, which option is to be taken forward. And then we might come back in later, or another consultant might come back in later to do a more detailed design exercise. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are just a few projects where we've done this exercise. So Heathrow Airport is, again, another fairly long-standing project within Arup. So the image on the left is a pretty early output that we would have done. So essentially, Heathrow would have given us their forecasts for passenger growth for the next 20 or 30 years, and we'd have assigned that to what we think onward mode they would take. So be that bus, train, car, or whatever. And the graph, or the chart, sorry, figure on the left shows the impact on the underground and rail network in London. So what that does is it tells us if the impact is significant, or if the existing network can handle it okay, or if there needs to be an additional piece of infrastructure, be that more trains on, say, the Piccadilly line, or an additional railway link, such as the Eastern Link or the Southern Link to the existing railway network that you may be aware of. Next slide, please. Pedestrian modelling is also a fairly significant activity of ours within this area. Typically, we use pedestrian modelling techniques for railway stations and for events, so where there's generally a lot of people. What we do is we use the software, a microsimulation software, to essentially model people within a building, or within a station, or a stadium, to assess the impact of the behavior of people in that area, or how the movement of people would change if you were to move a part of a building, or if there was a certain situation, such as in a station, a gate line that was closed or something. We'd assess the impact of that in a model. So the next couple of slides just show a couple of videos of that. This one is probably the least effective on a presentation, but this is part of the work that we did for the Olympics in 2012. So Arup had quite a significant involvement in that, and the figure on the right shows the output of a pedestrian modelling exercise for a lot of the Olympic Park during an event day. So I'm not sure if you can see, but the colours on the top show crowding in various parts of the park, and that's live as well. So there's individual people, or agents as they're called, walking around, and the different colors denote how busy it is in a certain area. And then the graphs on the bottom show the population of an area, in this case the stadium, over time. So as you can see, it kind of goes up when there's an event about to start, and then it'll change over time as the event goes on and as the event ends. So this just allows us to look at how we expect a venue to perform over the course of the day. So like I said, we also do a lot of this work on stations, and we've done quite a bit of this for the various crossrail stations. Not quite sure where this one is, to be honest. But essentially what this is testing is the escalator capacity. And we'll do this for various different scenarios. So there'll be a typical peak hour scenario. There'll be a scenario where the trains are disrupted for whatever reason, and we'll show the impact of that, which is probably people crowding on the platform, and a reduction in capacity at the gate line and stuff like that. And we'd also be able to assess what would happen if one of the escalators broke. So would the remaining escalators be able to cope with the increase in demand? Is there an alternative route that people would take? That kind of thing. So essentially what we're doing is validating a design, but also informing a design, working closely with architects to design the building. Microsimulation is a pretty common way of doing this assessment for the highway network as well. So we've done this at Euston Station, which is another long-standing project with Arup. That's kind of a theme on these major projects. So what you see here is a model of the HS2 Euston Station and the surrounding area. So the station itself is colored in grey, green, etc. And the road network around it, including the new bus station and taxi facility, are modelled. And we'll do this for two main reasons. One is to show that our design actually works and to inform our design development, but also to give reassurance to the local authority, in this case, Transport for London, that the impact of our design is not significant enough to have a massive adverse effect on the local highway network. And that, as I said earlier, would be, I guess, a component of a large transport assessment for a major project. Next slide, please. So then we get into rail. These are just a quick overview of some of the types of work that we do. So give me some examples. Operational performance advice is probably the most interesting for me anyway. So we'll model the railway network. So we'll develop a sort of base model of the network, and then if there's any changes proposed, we'll model those to see if, I guess, A, they're viable, and B, to assess the impact or the knock-on effect on the rest of the network. So an example would be if a stretch of railway is considered congested, we might model the potential impact of adding a grade separated junction or another track alongside. So we'd be able to assess the impact of that capacity increase and inform the feasibility study for the project. Next slide, please. And yeah, these are just a few example projects. So we worked with Surrey County Council to inform the rail strategy as part of their transport strategy. So Surrey are obviously not a rail operator, but we worked with them to I guess, advise them on how they could lobby the DFT to improve rail services in their area. And we'd have done this through a range of measures like rail operations and modeling as discussed there, but also looking at how stations could be improved as well. And we also looked at how we might be able to close some level crossings, which was quite an interesting project, because we also looked at how because that also required looking at the impact on local communities and the road network as well. And yeah, the next project there is, so we worked with the Office of Road and Rail to improve, I guess, their strategies for how they appraise projects in terms of how the modeling is actually done. So not only would we do the modeling, but in this case, we were employed to develop guidelines for how that modeling is kind of undertaken. So that was quite an interesting one for the team. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so that's where I begin. Can you hear me well? I assume so. Okay, let's begin. After Rob has outlined what TCS does, TCS, by the way, stands for Transport Consulting London. That's one of the many acronyms I've begun to take on once beginning in this job. I imagine the same as any other job, but I'm here to talk about life at Arup, which is, in my opinion, the more interesting part. So if you join as a graduate, like I did, there's usually a very exciting induction week, which I didn't get to do because of COVID, but I assume if you apply this year and join next year or the year after, there may be a chance that it will return. So lucky you. That's mainly for team building and meeting people in other disciplines that you wouldn't usually work with, but occasionally you do. And you would also be made aware of many opportunities of learning, whether that be in software like GIS, modeling software, like many of the very exciting ones you saw on the screen just then, or whether that be through professional qualifications. So I think there was a question in the chat as well about whether there are any professional qualifications that you can do to advance a career in transport planning. There is something called the Transport Planning Society, which has a professional development scheme, and something called the CIHT, which is the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport, I suppose, that also has some sort of professional qualification. So I think the slides get into more detail about them in a bit. But yeah, most importantly, learning from knowledgeable people you're surrounded by. That supports the idea of a 70-20-10 ratio of learning, where 70% refers to like on-the-job learning, which I found very true because you're constantly learning on the job, and 20% is from other people, and 10% is from formal learning. So that might be like online courses. Moving on. I think these are things that HR will go through with you on your interview day if you were to do one. But essentially, I think the main things to note here is the flexible benefits to be able to buy or sell days of holiday as you need. So some people might find that very helpful as travel opens up. And also within the flexible benefits, I remember being very excited, I don't know why, about buying a dental program, because I wouldn't usually buy that myself, but then if it's offered to me and then it's not being taxed, I feel, why not? I should do it. So I've been benefiting off that, not that I asked. And there are various other things, and membership for up to 3 professional institutions, because like Transport Planning Society and CIHT, they have a membership fee. So in order to be a member, you have to pay for it. But Arup reimburses for up to 3, which is plenty in my opinion. And conference attendance, I haven't attended any as of yet, so I can't comment on that. But moving on, there are lots of social activities, which I'm sure lots of you will be very excited about. I think they used to be a lot more exciting than what they are now, for very obvious reasons. But I've recently joined the netball team, which is fun because I haven't played for a long time, and everyone is super friendly and supportive, and it's a great way to meet people outside of your team. So you wouldn't have met them otherwise, but it's a great way in community to get to know one another. And we have a Christmas party. I haven't been to one yet, but I look forward to this year's one. And that's a photo of lots of graduates. I don't know when this was taken. It's just a nice photo. I'm not in it. But that means we're going into the section about life as a graduate at Arup. So this is all about me. I think in the chat there were questions about what kind of background I had before applying to transport planning. So I did my bachelor's in geography, which is a common degree lots of people have done in the team. I think there's like team geography and team engineering and team other. So I'd say it's a third split between people's backgrounds. With that being said, people have done all sorts of very interesting and proving to be useful degrees in the other category. I know people who've done economics, maths, English, just many other degrees. So in response to the question about do you have to have a particular engineering degree or similar technical-based degree to work in the discipline? No, or at least not in Arup. For other firms, I can't comment. But after that geography degree, I did a master's in infrastructure planning, appraisal, and development. I think this degree was what kind of aligned me to the planning field, because as the name entails, it's very planning and appraisal focused. So it refers to all sorts of infrastructure, not just transport, but this is the job I ended up applying to. And now I work mostly in cities and rail. I suppose the slides that Rob had to whiz through earlier may not have been the clearest in terms of what you do, because it certainly took me a while to actually understand what each area of the business does in terms of its technical day-to-day tasks. But in case that makes any sense to you right now, I've put in a few flags that represent me. My parents are Chinese, so that's the Chinese flag. I grew up in New Zealand, so that's the New Zealand flag, and now I live in the UK. And this is a photo of my desk on a random day where I eat and have a very lovely hot chocolate from the coffee machine in the kitchen while I work. And that's my name tag, which I use to swipe in and out of the building. And this is a screenshot from the inclusion page for LGBTQ month, where we make a pledge to be a supportive ally, and then we can pick up one of these very lovely masks that have the flag and Arup on it, and that's mine, and we will dress up in appropriate colours. So that's just an example of an initiative we have regularly to be a very supportive, diverse and inclusive organisation. And on the right-hand side here, this, again, is a screenshot, or I think I took a photo of my computer screen of a film screening of Sir Arup while he was still alive, when he began the firm. And I found it very inspirational, because he talks about how if you live to earn money, and that makes no sense, because he would rather give up living and therefore won't need it to earn any money. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense, because it's more like that constant dilemma of work to live or live to work, kind of. So I'm glad it really aligns with my values. And just finally, on the corner, I have a photo from a team picnic we had a while ago when we weren't allowed to gather indoors. Well, we're still not encouraged to gather in the office, but that was very nice. I got to meet a lot of people in person, which was fun and different. And next, I'll just briefly talk about a couple of projects I've worked on recently. On the left-hand side, I have an example of a site travel plan, which I think Rob briefly mentioned as part of the city's work we do in development planning. So this is a map of a site, and then I am to develop a travel plan for the users of the site. So I assess current transport options, identify targets for each mode, and then outline how we will achieve those aims. And then secondly, we have a scheme's business case. I'm being quite vague here across all the projects, because some of them are confidential, so I can't name which scheme it is, but it's a very exciting scheme. It's in rail, it's building a new station, and then we identify drivers of change, so why we need a new station, lots of different reasons, and then that will lead into objectives of the new scheme, and then we'll have measures of success on the right-hand side in the third column to appraise the different options through. So that will give us different scorings for, I think, 3 usually, scheme options, and then we'll decide on one, and then we'll proceed with it. And I think that's very interesting, because it's a very high-level exercise where you get to be creative and really determine lots of exciting things going on across the country. And then lastly, this is a map of London. It's some sort of heat map using some sort of criteria. We've done so many of these, I'm not sure which one this one is, but it was for an integrated impact assessment, which was for, I can't say this either, it's very exciting. I can't wait to talk about it, but I can't. For assessing the impact of this particular scheme on different parts of London and for different demographic groups as well. It's called integrated because it involves, there's the economic impact assessment, which I was in charge of, and there was also health, environmental and equalities impact assessments. So we had to work together, and that was with people from like outside of transport consulting, which was very exciting. I got to meet new people, virtually of course, but that was one of my most, I'd say, exciting pieces of work to date. And I think this is the very last slide. This is a screenshot of my Teams calendar. We use Microsoft Teams for our day-to-day work, in addition to Outlook for mail and OneDrive and things like that. Essentially, I use this as a tool to help myself understand what I need to do across the week and to plan my time accordingly. So usually, if we were to divide up the things I tend to do, I have various project meetings. Those are for different pieces of work I do with different people. So some of them are quite regular. So I think for this one, it's like a repeating thing where we have it every single week to catch up where we are for long-term projects. And there are also other ones where it's a one-off thing and someone just decides to put something in my diary and I say, okay. And there are also informal learning. So there are often talks and I'd say events where people, they usually have very useful names like charrettes, where people come together and share project findings or just various interesting ideas, and we have Q&A. A bit similar to this, where people put questions in the chat and then the presenter addresses them. And they're very interesting because they're usually based on things I'm not very familiar with. So I consider them informal learning. And there are other commitments. So I think the ones on Monday, if I click the screen, there we go. These are the informal learning events. There's SDGs in transport. I'm the Transport Consulting London's UN Sustainable Development Goals champion for this. Oh, yeah, champion. So we have this regular meeting to talk about how we want to incorporate the SDGs in our daily work. And there are these two events where we listen to people talk about exciting projects. And then in these other commitments, this is my catch up with my line manager, which happens every week. These two are resourcing meetings, one for the cities group and one for the rail group, because I dip my fingers into both. And then we have various project meetings. I don't know whether these all go away. No, they don't. Okay, I'll go back to this slide then. But yeah, this is essentially my typical week, and in the blank spaces I do my work. And you can also slot in personal appointments for things that you have to go to. So I think this is June. At that point I was looking for a flat, so I was using my lunch breaks to go on viewings, but it's all very flexible. I can come back a bit later as long as I don't miss any other meetings and things like that. So I hope this gives a very high level, very brief, vague, but hopefully helpful insight into what's like as a grad in transport consulting. I think now we address some of the questions in the chat. I suppose that's how it will work.
Yeah, that's okay. Right. Thank you so much. And if you kind of go on the stage tab and then the Q&A, there's quite a lot of questions for you both in there.
Yeah. Am I meant to keep sharing my screen or shall I stop sharing it?
Well, it's up to you completely.
Okay. I'll stop sharing then, because there we go.
Do you want us to go through them ourselves, or are you going to call out the questions?
Yeah, I can call them out.
Whichever works.
Yeah. So most recent question is, how competitive is the Arup application process?
Oh, good question.
I think,
you go.
Sorry. I can only answer this based on grad application, but essentially I went to the assessment centre and there were 16 people. And at the time they said they were going to hire 4 out of 16, so 1 and 4. But I don't know how many applications they received before asking us to attend the assessment centre.
Yeah, so I can elaborate on that a little bit. So what happens is you'll apply kind of centrally and you'll specify what office you'd like to work in. So after that, the human resources team will kind of sift out the CVs to be sent to the various teams. So that's kind of where I know the numbers. So every year we get about 50 applications, and as Josie said, that gets down to 16 or 20 or thereabouts for interview. So I guess that gives you an idea of the level of competition or interest in the roles, I guess.
Thank you. The second question was, will you be collaborating with more organisations like the Land Collective in the future, event-wise? This is the first time I've heard of Arup, and I'm so glad I came. Super interesting.
That's good to hear. I get, yeah, a resounding yes. We're always happy to do these kinds of events. So yeah, happy to come back again. And yeah, like I said, it kind of depends on who people know, really. So I assume this was just organized with Arup HR, and a similar thing will happen with other organizations. And then we in transport will be asked to kind of present, or just, yeah, give a little talk or something. But yeah, it's something that we do quite often. So yeah, more than happy to do that as a team.
Awesome. And a question from Curtis was, what do you both think are the key attributes you need to show during Arup's application process as a graduate, especially if you might not have the relevant work experience or post-grad qualification?
Good question.
If I make a start on that, I think the most important attribute is your passion for the area of work you work in. So we have very specific disciplines, and in transport, I just think I'm outside of work. Before I joined Arup, across every single person I knew, I was the person most fascinated by trains. You could say I'm a nerd in that sense, but then in Arup, I'm surrounded by like-minded people. So they like to see people who are excited about the potential things they're working with. And I know people working in facade engineering, they're really excited about their work, and there are people in geotechnics. And it's just all about being passionate about learning more about what's going on in that industry, even without it being part of your work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the most essential thing. An interest and a knowledge of Arup helps. And then if, as the question suggested, you're coming from a non-transport background, if you can talk about, interesting experiences either at university or in a different role, be that in work or in a pastime or a different project or something, that's helpful too.
Thank you. The next question was about neurodiversity and if Arup employs neurodiverse people.
Yes. Not much more I can say about that, really. We don't discriminate based on neurodiversity, so yes.
The next question was, what sort of professional qualifications are there that you can do to advance your career in transport planning?
So there's quite a few based along the lines of the sort of educational backgrounds that Josie mentioned earlier. So I'm currently, well, not currently, but taking a break, pursuing an engineering qualification. So that would be with the ICE, so Chartered Engineer, but you can also get an engineering qualification through the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport. The most common one is probably a transport planning professional, so TPP, and that's with either the CIHT or the Transport Planning Society. Others, there's a few people who are chartered by the RTPI. So if they have a town planning background, that would be the way to go. They're probably the main ones, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. And somebody asked, do you have to consider risk for every design?
Yes. So given the nature of our work as engineers, that's a definite part of our job. As transport planners, the risk we consider would be less formal. So we're never, or we're rarely ultimately responsible for owning a design. So we'll never really own a risk register for a building or a master plan or anything. So the ultimate risk will never be owned by us. We'll often be asked to advise on different risks, and we'll take into account some stuff that might be considered risks in our work. But most of the typical engineering risks will be considered by the more typical engineers, I guess, your civil engineers, your structural engineers, etc.
Thank you. And this person asked for Josie. Do you have any advice for international students who want to build a career in the UK built environment?
Good question. I think the biggest barrier I faced when I was applying was that most companies didn't have the status to sponsor for a tier 2 working visa, but Arup does, so it's one of the few firms I did apply to. So in case that's what you're after, I guess it's good and bad, as in it narrows down your focus. You don't have to apply to that many firms.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I know a few people have asked about the visa issue and things like that, so I think people are quite interested in that. Is there a need to introduce sustainable modes of transport for new projects or new regeneration projects and things?
I'd say definitely. That's a lot of what our cities and rail work do. I don't know much about strategic modelling, so I can't speak for it. But aside from, I remember talking about one of the site's travel plans I mentioned briefly earlier on about how we would produce a travel plan and have mode share targets. So in those we would have higher targets for cycling and walking, for example, and a lower one to reduce car travel and so on. And also in rail, if we were to build a new station, we want to have some of the metrics to appraise the options which have higher or better connectivity with onward active modes. So if it has better cycle parking, or it improves severance across the city centre for people to walk, things like that. It's an overall, I'd say, aim for our work.
Fantastic. The next question was, do you need to have an engineering degree or similarly technical-based degree to work in Arup and or in transport consulting?
Definitely not for both of those things, I would say. It's quite common for engineers to become transport planners, but equally you can be, like in our team, there's geographers, there's planners, there's some people with maths and physics backgrounds, so it's very, very diverse. Certainly in transport. Obviously, if you're going to a more engineering focused discipline in Arup, then you've less flexibility in your educational background. But yeah, certainly in transport, it can be pretty diverse.
Yeah. And somebody asked, what was the most exciting and most stressful project you both worked on and why?
While Rob thinks, I'll quickly take this simple way out and talk about the same project again. The one, if anyone remembers, I had a slide with 3 projects on the slide, and the one on the right-hand side was a heat map of London that was for integrated impact assessment. That's very interesting because I live in London, so it's very close to home, and I got to see.
Because I took my action.
I got to see how it will materialize in many different ways, in financial terms, in demographic terms. So but I don't know where that's going yet. So it's like in action. So that's exciting. And in terms of being stressful, I think it's not because the project itself was stressful. It was the way that I, as someone very, very junior, I was given the opportunity to liaise with the client directly, and we will meet every week to discuss my report's progress. And I found that a little bit daunting because I would always feel unprepared, but then after the session I'll be like, oh, that was okay. They were very nice and understanding, and they think I did pretty well. So it's like a repetition of that process every week. I don't want to look bad for the team, kind of, but I wouldn't say it's the fault of the project, if that makes sense.
So mine was probably a couple of years ago. Our team in Auckland in New Zealand was working on a design competition for a light rail system there. And I was asked to go there to help out just for like 6 weeks or something. So yeah, that was, because it was a design competition, the timescales were quite tight. So yeah, it was quite stressful. The role was less transport planning and more sort of stakeholder engagement and design management with an element of transport planning as well. So it was quite full on, quite stressful, quite varied. But it's also probably the project that I learned the most on. And yeah, it was great. Got to meet quite a lot of new people, and yeah, learned a lot about, I guess, myself, cliche as that sounds, and and about my work as well. So yeah, I'll go with that one.
Thank you. And somebody asked, did you decide to go into transport planning off the bat, or did you rotate and find that it was super interesting?
I decided off the bat. So my degree was in civil engineering, and for my summer placement after my third year, I worked as a site engineer in Battersea Power Station, and I just hated it. But then in my final year, we did like modules in both transport planning and highway engineering, and I really enjoyed those. So I decided to apply for this, and yeah, there I am.
Yeah, similar story. I did a work experience in real estate that was in a
But I think yeah.
I don't think I'm meant to name it, but it was nice. It was fun, but I wanted to try something different. So this is my first like proper job I applied to.
Brilliant, thank you. And another person asked, what are some of the most unlikely things you have to consider when building out a strategic transport plan?
I'm not quite sure what that means, to be honest.
If we take strategic transport plan, focusing on the strategic element, if we talk about like a strategic model,
yeah, perhaps that was it.
Best understanding of it. I've had rather limited experience with modeling, but not sure if anyone's heard of Vism. It's basically a software that models like micro simulation scenarios, and I found it very interesting when we had to consider like different junctions and how cars will flow from like one. They were like names for it, but I can't remember, from like one road through the junction. Let's say it's a roundabout to another, and there's just so many combinations, and some would turn all the way around to make a U-turn, and they would really affect the numbers if you want to think about how many cars are going through which direction through this particular roundabout. So I'd say that's something I found interesting.
There's often something random that pops up in projects that you don't really expect, and it's often from, say, a stakeholder. So we do these sort of stakeholder engagement meetings to engage with the local community or businesses or residents who might be affected by a project. And sometimes they raise an issue or bring up a seemingly random issue, and our client will sort of get worried or perceive it as a potential risk and ask us to look into it. Quite often it's a non-issue, but it's just something that we do to kind of bring communities along and ensure that they feel like a part of the project. So kind of ensure that involvement, I guess. But yeah, oftentimes it comes about in very random ways.
Yeah. And another question was, how easy or difficult is it to work collaboratively with so many large companies for projects like Meridian Water? We learned how large the project was yesterday, and I imagine there'll be lots of disagreements about how things are run.
Yeah, it can be quite challenging sometimes. Certainly, I found in the last year it's been a lot more challenging than in other years. So on my project, Euston Station, for the first 2 years that I worked on it, it was really good, and it was easy to collaborate with our external partners in architecture and landscape architecture and other disciplines. It's less so now because it's all online and stuff. But I guess to answer your question, it's mitigated to an extent by the fact that a lot of the time the people that we work with are within Arup. So a lot of our work will be in the design team itself, and then when we step outside of that, we're working with, say, another developer or a local authority or something like that, and that typically is where the challenge lies. But most of our work will be kind of internal or within the design team, so it's not too bad.
That's really interesting. Another question was, what changes in transport behaviour have you noticed during the pandemic, and how do you think it will be managed in the future?
That's an interesting one. I'm actually doing a master's at the moment, and one of our projects has been on community engagement around low traffic neighborhoods in London. So I guess that's the biggest change, in that local authorities have tried to make changes to support active travel, be that by introducing more cycle lanes and stuff, or introducing low traffic neighborhoods. And the interesting part for me is that they've been so successful in some places, but the complete opposite in others. And it's all down to, I guess, the community's response, the political will, how the schemes have been designed in the first place. In terms of how it'll change long term, it's difficult to say really, because like we've seen already that a lot of those changes, people walking and cycling more, has kind of reverted back to the norm of people driving a lot more as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that manifests. There's also the issue of people working from home more often, which will obviously reduce the number of trips people take. So there might be a net reduction in people traveling, certainly in the peak, but there might be a net increase in people traveling overall. So yeah, I've read so many articles about people speculating about this for the last year that, yeah, it's very difficult to say. Anything can happen.
Just to briefly add to that, from a rail perspective, I think lots of speculation surrounding rail demand is a smoothing of peaks. So dividing up I wouldn't say like same, but like similar number of trips, but more evenly throughout the day, so we don't have to cater for such a large peak. But yeah, that's all speculation at this point as well. But I find that very interesting.
Yep, and then you had a question about the Arup early careers scheme, so things like graduate schemes, internships, and apprenticeships. Do you know when they all kind of open at Arup, the applications for them?
I do. I asked this question this morning. Give me 2 seconds.
Yes. For grad applications, it's mid-September, and for apprentice applications, it's mid-October. But I'm not personally familiar with internships.
Yeah, so internships will be advertised on arup.com as well. But internships are also common by just talking to people within Arup to see if you can organize one as well. So if anyone was interested in that, we can contact you about it, or you can contact us, I guess.
Yeah, I'll be putting both of their emails in the event chat, so you all have them. And I think we kind of touched on a little bit of this question earlier, but it was talking about standout application tips if you want to become a graduate transport planner at Arup.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything we mentioned earlier, right? Around just demonstrating your passion and interest in working in transport, but also your own experience and your knowledge of Arup. It's been 5 years for me. Josie, do you have any more recent advice?
I think in the written application part, there's only so much you can show in the number of words you're given. So I think if I were to give a piece of advice on the interview stage, whether they be through video or in person, this is so cliche. I hate myself for saying this, but be yourself. Because I know some people who go into interviews thinking that there's a certain way they should behave because that's what they think people in this profession does, or they're just hitting those keywords that they think will be important for the questions that's being asked. But I think for me, it was very important to stick to what I found important and present myself in a way that's usually me, because after all, they're just looking for people that they'd like to work with. So if you're being yourself, and they'll know if they want to work with you or not, and if they do, you're hired.
Great, thank you. And lastly, one of the last questions was, is it normal for graduates to start in January for Josie?
No, it's usually September. I was meant to start last September, but that was delayed. Like many other jobs, I'm just grateful it's not cancelled, to be honest. So I think it should be just this year. That's January as a starting date.
Amazing. I think that's about it for the questions. But again, in the event chat, I've put in their emails so that you can send really good and nice emails over to Josie and Robert for any kind of further assistance or questions that you may have about a career in transport planning. Thank you so much, Josie and Robert, for taking this session. It was super insightful, super interesting. I learned a lot of things myself. But yeah, thank you so much. And everyone will be back again at 3 p.m. for our following and last session for the Virtual Internship Programme.
Thank you.
No worries.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
You.
Thanks.